requests for topics for the class. I have a stack sitting on my desk right now. I've had some pretty good input, so anybody who wants to give any more input, feel free to write it on a note, and you can just put it right on my desk. Don't put it in my hand because I'll lose it. It's what I do. No, I actually put yours, as soon as you handed it to me, I put it on the desk. It's there. It's safe and sound. Okay. We're going to continue in Luke. We're in Luke chapter 22. We got some pretty weird text today, so that'll be fun and interesting. To be honest, it's some text that I don't really know what to do with. So we're going to just kind of play around with them a little bit. And I think it's interesting because if we struggle with some of the meaning, imagine his disciples. You know, oftentimes they were confused, and you know, they didn't have the whole New Testament like we do. So when Jesus spoke to them and talked about fulfilling scriptures, and he talked about he was gonna suffer, he was gonna die, they didn't really understand until it happened, and then things made sense to them. There's a saying, they say hindsight is always 20/20. Though I don't believe in that saying, I understand the meaning behind it. We do see more clearly in retrospect after things have happened. A lot of times we stop and we say, oh, that's what they meant. So that's certainly the case for Jesus. So last week we ended with the Lord's Supper, followed by the disciples asking who was going to be the greatest. And I just think it's really ironic that Jesus, as he's talking about emptying yourself and becoming a servant, and the word he uses is bondservant or slave. Doulos is the Greek word. Jesus is literally telling them that if you want to be a part of the kingdom, you've got to be a slave. If you want to follow me, if you want to be my disciple, if you want to be my follower, you've got to deny yourself, take up your cross daily, and follow me. Jesus is on his hands and knees washing the disciples' feet. And we know that from John's account. And then the disciples get up from that and start wondering who the greatest is. I mean, hours before Jesus dies. And if you can imagine, as Jesus hung on the cross, what was going through the minds of the disciples who hours before were just thinking, you know, and I don't think they were necessarily arrogant or, you know, like flanking each other and, you know, pushing their way to the top. But I think it was you know, in their mind it was a valid question. Who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom? Hours later, Jesus is hanging on the cross. I think in that instant, everything started to make sense to them. All this talk about denying yourself, all this talk about serving, all this talk about not positioning yourself. It's not about positioning yourself. It's not even about leading. Jesus doesn't talk a whole lot about leading, does he? You know, we talk a lot about leadership. I talk a lot about leadership. Jesus didn't. He talked about service. He talked about if you want to be great, you need to be slave of all. You need to serve people. And that's not glamorous at all, is it? It's usually frustrating, it's discouraging, it's thankless. And that's the point. So right after that, Jesus predicts Peter's denial. And this is powerful. Verse 31, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you. This is interesting. If you look at the little footnote there, and I preached about this fairly recently. When he says, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you, the word for you is plural. So he said, Satan demanded to have all of you. He didn't ask. He didn't suggest. He didn't imply. He demanded. You remember another place where Satan, it was kind of a lesser tone, less, what's the word I'm looking for? Less aggressive. Yeah, Job. And look at the outcome of that. See, in Job, Satan didn't demand, Satan asked. And God granted. Here, he demanded. Now, question, and I don't want to read too much into this, but why do you think the difference? Why do you think with Job, Satan asked, and with the disciples, he demanded? You ever notice, any of you, that the closer you get to God, right, that mountaintop experience, things are just going great. You feel connected to God. You feel wonderful. You feel full of faith. You feel optimistic. You feel happy. You feel connected to each other. Question, what happens? I can find out in a second. Let's just find out, because that's interesting. The ESV usually is very close to the literal translation, which is why I like the ESV, because you get a lot of variance between translations. Does anybody else's translation say somebody differently? Okay, so give me 1 second. Boy, technology is great and terrible. Yeah, that's right. Yes. Yeah, so the word, this is not the typical word for ask. This is, the word is exiteo, which means it's a stronger form of asking. It means to demand of, to ask for, or to beg earnestly. So it's a much stronger form of ask. It still means to ask, but it's a stronger form of it. And actually, the X, anytime you hear X, that means out of. And so sometimes they add the X to words in Greek for more force. So it probably has a literal sense of getting something out of someone, pulling it out of someone, not giving up until you've gotten it. That's very common in the Greek language to add some form of that means to draw out. Yeah. Yeah. That's exactly what I was thinking. I think that the ante was upped. You look at Job. Job was faithful. He was righteous. He was upright. The disciples, they're actively carrying out. I mean, if you think about it, what happens when Jesus ascends falls on the shoulders of the disciples. There are 11 people that you have the weight of the Messianic Great Commission to be initiated by 11 people. Now, it's not that the 11 are going to go out and they're going to be the ones carrying the Great Commission, but they're the ones who initiate it. If the 11 disciples, blow up in a chariot accident, their chariot bus doesn't make it, it's done. Now, I know we can say, well, God is powerful, and He would find a way to make it happen. Well, yes, and no. I think I read a book once called The God Who Risks, and I really liked that book because it talked about God as risk taker. Les Ferguson, my friend Les, just wrote a book called Still Wrestling, and he talks about the weakness of God. That God exercises weakness, restraint. God who could come in and just, God who made the world can do anything, but he chooses not to. God exercises weakness because where there's weakness, there's power. Paul says that. So Jacob wrestles with God. Who won the battle, by the way? Jacob. Yeah, but I mean, he's an 80-something-year-old man, and he's wrestling all night long with God. God could have blew a little wind on him and fractured him into a million pieces. But God chose weakness to demonstrate his power. Yeah. Yeah, the fulfillment. Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's divine weakness. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you'll see the foreknowledge is an interesting thing, and we don't talk about foreknowledge a whole lot in, traditionally within the churches of Christ. We don't talk a lot about that because I think part of it is we don't want to sound too Calvinistic, so we kind of stay away from that. But if you really think about it, foreknowledge is, it's all through the Bible, and it's pretty clear. So here it's interesting because this conversation, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you, meaning all of you, that he might sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail, now still plural. And when you, singular, have turned again. That's interesting, isn't it? There's a shift to the singular when Jesus addresses Peter. But when you, so Satan is asked to sift all of you out. In other words, he is about to rock your world. And they found out, pretty quickly, didn't they? I think it's okay to say this in Bible class, but all hell broke loose. It was ugly. It was 3 days of sheer terror, panic, confusion, sadness, just all kinds of emotions mixed together, and Satan was actively working. In fact, in Luke's account later on, Jesus makes the comment to the antagonizers, and he says something to the effect of, darkness will overtake, and this is your hour. That's a powerful statement.
You were talking about God and if the 11 that failed or whatever would happen there. Of course, God, from his viewpoint, knew exactly what was going to happen.
Sure, yeah.
We don't think of it, but the devil did.
That's right.
There's a song, there's an old song from Carmen, I think is the singer, and it's about like a boxing match between God and the devil, and Jesus, and he knocks out Jesus with his death. And then God starts counting, but instead of counting 1, 2, 3, like going up to 10, he counts 10, 9, 8. The devil's there like, what are you doing? Why are you counting down from 10 to 1? Like, so from
Yeah.
the perspective, he didn't realize what God's plan was. He didn't
Yeah.
know that through killing Jesus, that he was actually fulfilling what needed to happen.
Yeah.
He thought it was a knockout blow.
Yeah.
Like that's
Yeah.
the visualization that the song gives.
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah.
The devil's point of view, yeah, if he was able to knock out the 11, yeah, it would have been a big success. Whereas,
Yeah.
of course, God knew what was going to happen.
Yeah. But I do still think there would have been another. I mean, God had a plan, and that clearly that plan was going to happen. And he foretells Judas, he foretells Peter, but he also knows that, and he knows what to pray for, and that's important too. Jesus knew exactly what to pray for. It's interesting. I've prayed for all of you that your faith may not fail. And when, not if. That's interesting. When you, Peter, singular, when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. What happened? What happened, immediately after Jesus ascended? Who's the front runner of the 11? Peter. And really Peter and John. But Peter, the day of Pentecost, Peter gets up and just hits this home run, kick you in the gut sermon. 3,000 people are baptized. How did that happen? A few days before, nope, I don't know. I don't know the man. I don't know who he is. Because of this. And listen to Peter's response prior to, just a couple hours or a few hours before he denies Jesus. Peter said to him, Lord, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and to death. Yeah. My nickname for Peter is 110, because he was 110%, whether right or wrong. Peter did it 110%. Jesus said, I tell you, Peter, the rooster will not crow this day until you deny 3 times that you know me. Jesus isn't beating around the bush. He's pretty black and white. Verse 35. And then he said to them, when I sent you out with no money bag or knapsack or sandals, did you lack anything? You remember that? When Jesus sends out the disciples and he says, take with you nothing except the clothes on your back. You stay with people. You find people who are hospitable. You stay with them. If they reject you, you wipe the dust off your sandals and move on, right? In fact, it's interesting. Jesus tells them when you're walking along the road, don't greet anybody. Don't talk to anybody. Why do you think that is? Stranger danger. No, I don't think. It's a good theory. I think the heart of that is that Jesus taught his disciples to be mission driven. They were on a mission to go to a town, and what happens when you stop and greet people? What happens when you say hi? Sometimes, a lot of times, they want something from you, but more than anything, they want what? Conversation. No. Yeah. 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 This is interesting, and I recorded a podcast, I don't know, probably a month and a half ago. Jeff Miller and another friend of mine from high school, they do a podcast together, and so they interview people. And I'd recorded this podcast, and Jeff brought up about relationships, and he said, you taught me that it's relationships is that's what builds builds faith, and that's what helps the mission spread out and all that stuff. And I said, my position on that's kind of changing a little bit. I think sometimes we put too much focus on relationships to where we actually hinder the growth of the gospel, because we become so relationship driven that we fail to be mission driven. And what happens is, when you're relationship driven, got to build friends, got to spend time. We spend 5, 6, 7, 8 years working on relationships and really investing in that relationship in hopes that somebody might come to Christ. And Jesus didn't do that. He had 3 years of ministry. And quite honestly, I think Jesus and John the Baptist, and then probably most, if not all, of the disciples were just really weird dudes. And I hope that doesn't come off as sounding blasphemous, but they weren't relational people. They weren't like sit around the campfire, get to know us, sing some hymns around the camp. They were like just driven by mission. And so Jesus is telling them, when he sent them out, take no money bag, take nothing except the clothes on your back. Go out, don't greet people along the road, don't talk to people. Once you get to the town, you speak to them, you take care of their needs, right? And they did. They healed people, they raised people from the dead, they took care of people's needs, but they didn't hang around. They didn't wait and build these relationships and make sure that their faith was growing and that they were, that wasn't their job. And actually today's sermon is about that we all have different roles in that process, and some people, like Paul and like the disciples, like Jesus, they're just foundation builders. And that's it. They build a foundation and they walk away. Yeah. 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 Sure. Now, it doesn't, what I said in that podcast, that doesn't mean that they weren't building relationships, but what it means and what I see biblically is that relationships were secondary to mission. Okay, so mission is always the primary focus. You have a job to go in and to do. Look at our soldiers, right? Our soldiers go into these really hostile areas, and they go in, and their ultimate goal really is to rescue people who are under oppression. It's the mission of the church, but they do it with a lot more weapons. But do you ever see the pictures of these kids and these village people coming up to our soldiers, and they're just embracing them, and they're just, they're weeping, and they're so grateful for our, American soldiers, for saving them from the hand of the oppressors. Our soldiers take time to build those relationships. When they go and they rebuild countries that we went in and decimated, they build relationships, but that's not their primary function as soldiers. Their primary function is they have a mission to go in and to rescue people from the hands of the oppressors. This is an interesting passage. It's a little bit bizarre, but Jesus said, did you lack anything when I told you to go out and take nothing with you? They said, nothing. He said to them, but now let the one who has a money bag take it, and likewise a knapsack, and let the one who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. It's interesting, isn't it? A little strange. It's the exact opposite of what he told them when he sent them out, right? Yeah, but now he's telling them, go out. The things that I told you not to buy, not to take, not to have with you, now I'm telling you, go get them. Why do you think that is? And again, verse 37, we'll finish this, and then we'll go back and kind of play with that a little bit. Verse 37, for I tell you that this scripture must be fulfilled in me. And he was numbered with the transgressors. For what is written about me has its fulfillment. And they said, just listen to how bizarre this response is. And they said, "Look, Lord, here are 2 swords." He said to them, "It is enough." Now, John Mark Hicks, I heard him do a talk on this. And it's interesting how this passage changes whether you're a pacifist or whether you're a, Second Amendment, belief in being able to defend yourself. That really changes how you look at this scripture. And I think part of that is we read a lot into this passage that's probably not there. But John Mark Hicks, he was talking about this, and he said, the Greek is just as ambiguous as the English in this when Jesus says, "It is enough." And he said, how did Jesus say that? When they pulled the 2 swords out, did he say, "It's enough"? Or did he say, "It's enough"? Or did he say, "That's enough"? Or did he say, "Enough"? We don't know. And the tone, whatever tone Jesus used in this, changes the meaning of it dramatically. And we have no idea. In written word, it's certainly not in verbal because we weren't there, we have no idea the tone of Jesus whenever he said, "It is enough." So, obviously they had swords with them. Jesus, for the first time, is telling them that if you don't have a sword, go out and get one. Because remember, the last time he spoke to them, he told them, "Get rid of your swords, get rid of everything. Don't take anything with you except the clothes on your back." Now Jesus changes that. He flips that and he says, "Okay, so I told you that, but now if you have no money bag, go out and get one. If you have no sword, sell your cloak and get one." They whip out 2 swords. like were they concealed? I mean, they just pull these swords out. It's like, where did they get the swords? I thought they weren't supposed to have this stuff. And we know for sure that Peter had a sword. How do we know that? He cuts the ear off of, what's the guy's name? Malthus or whatever it is, the guard who came and, they're ready to arrest Jesus. Peter cuts the ear off. That's probably the most likely explanation. He's using this figure of speech saying, you don't have to go around and vow poverty to be my disciple. That wasn't Jesus' point when he sent them out. It wasn't, for the rest of your lives you must be extremely poor, and if you have any wealth, then you're damned. That wasn't Jesus' point at all. Jesus' point when he sent out his disciples and said, "Don't take anything with you," was what? He's teaching them how to live emptying yourself, denying yourself, taking up your cross daily and following me. Jesus was, it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to practice it. And Jesus wasn't saying that, unless you go around and you're poor for the rest of your life, you can't be my disciple. Not at all. So I think that's probably the most likely explanation, is that he's using a figure of speech, not saying literally go out and get all this stuff and hurry up, but to say, you know what, if you start gaining some of these things back, you lacked nothing when you had nothing. Right? Did you lack anything when I sent you out with nothing? Their reply, nothing. We were taken care of. We were provided for. Jesus' point, I think, is this. If you start gaining things, you still will lack nothing. Be careful where you put your focus. But I still don't have a clue what he meant when he said it is enough. Here are 2 swords. It's enough.
Does that have, how talk more still do, I guess, more visual relation and those kind of things, like what we talked about before?
Yeah.
Is there something with the sword, like
Yeah.
You don't have a sword, and then he talks about not having a sword. Like he uses, it seems like the sword stands for something other than.
Yeah. I,
Even though they're literally saying, here, we have two swords.
yeah. I think so. So I'll close with this because it's kind of interesting, and my stance is I never publicly say my stance just because it's not that important. But my stance is I think scripturally, I think it's okay to defend yourself and other people, probably especially other people, to use deadly force. I have friends, and I don't disrespect their view. I don't see it, but they take a very pacifist view where it's never okay to use force. You can never, once Jesus came, all the need for war, it just melted away, and kind of like you win your enemy over with hugs and things like that. And I'm like, that doesn't work. It as deranged as King Jong-un is. The guys, they just executed one of his soldiers last week because he gave food to other soldiers. The guy's deranged, clearly deranged. Our sitting president, whether you like the guy or not, that's irrelevant, but our sitting president is the first sitting president ever to get a meeting, a face-to-face with a Korean dictator. How did he make that happen? Anybody know? Psychologically, how did he make that happen? Not just arrogant and strength, but what else? There was one thing in particular that got him to come out of hiding and start showing his face. Little Rocket Man. Remember the Little Rocket Man post? He was calling him Little Rocket Man. That was very intentional to make fun of him. Some people respond not by being coddled, but by aggression, or by people respond differently. Jesus, when he talked about winning your enemy over, pouring, heaping burning coals on their head by feeding them, giving them water, things like that. That's not a blanket thing to say that you treat all your enemies this way, because there are other times where, James and Peter and Jude and pick a disciple, they come unhinged at people who are oppressors. Jesus at the temple wasn't pouring glasses of water for the money changers. And he wasn't in the kitchen baking them food and, bringing it out and setting it in their lap. He was doing what? He's literally flipping tables over. He's making a big scene at the temple, which was a huge no-no. You didn't do that. Whereas in the South, they have a saying, you don't supposed to do that. You don't supposed to flip tables over. I mean, if you want to do that somewhere else, fine. But when you're in the temple, that's blasphemous. Jesus came unhinged, and he wasn't pouring glasses of water or wine and feeding people. Jesus was turning tables on the enemies and chasing them with whips. So, everything in context. But I think Bill's absolutely right. I think you're right that the sword stands for something, and Jewish people, I think they would have understood that as a redemptive symbol because of the wars that the Israelites went and when they took out the Canaanites. You have these wars that the Israelites went out and rescued themselves, really, but other people too. But the sword was a powerful symbol that it didn't stand for war as much as it stood for redemption. And so I think that's why when Peter pulls his sword out and cuts the guy's ear off. Jesus actually gets upset with him. I don't think because it was wrong to do that, but because who's the savior? Right? It's not Peter. And Jesus is the savior. And in that moment, it wasn't the proper context for doing it. Okay, we're going to stop there. We'll pick up in a few minutes. Thank you all.